So in a way, what you're saying is it's easier to technically make a game. It's harder to stand out and have an edge.
Well, it's harder to technically make a game too, is the other thing though. Again, it's easier to get started making a game, right? But again, if you're trying to make a high quality game,
Yeah.
you have maybe a lot of things you want to make sure are correct. Like I want my frame rate to be smooth, right?
Yeah.
I want audio to play with low latency, and I want to be able to play a lot of sound effects and stuff. And some of that is actually getting harder because the code that programmers have to work with is bigger and bigger piles, right? The operating systems are less reliable and more complicated to interface with, and so on. And things that that people think are features or that are features, legitimate features, make game development harder, and these things just keep stacking up. So here's one that'll blow everybody's mind, hopefully. Right now in the video game industry, it is an unsolved problem. Let's take a subset like the PC, because when you talk about consoles with specific hardware, it's different. But on the PC, there is no right answer to how do you make a game run with a smooth frame rate. Like that's just like an unsolvable problem. And it gets more unsolvable all the time. People who are interested, there's a guy named Alan Ladovac who's from Croatia. He used to be at Crow Team working on, Serious Sam kind of stuff, if you know those games. I don't know what he's doing now, but he wrote this essay about how hard it is just to try to render at a smooth frame rate if you're really trying to do it. And like, it's nearly impossible for a lot of reasons, right? So back in the day when you just had your Atari video game console or whatever, you knew that the TV was running at 60 hertz if you were in America or 50 hertz if you're in Europe, right? Now, what refresh rate is your monitor going to have? I don't know, right? Maybe it's got a fixed refresh rate. Maybe you have VSync turned off in the game, in which case we have to like manually wait around for some amount of time and then flip the thing. Whereas if you have VSync turned on, what that means is we actually like, I don't know how to, like we sort of lean on the monitor and wait for it to tell us to go again.
Yeah.
And that's a reliable way to get a smooth frame rate, except people can turn that off in the driver or like an NVIDIA control panel.
Right.
And then your game has to cope with that. Or then now there's, G-Sync and AMD's version of that, whatever that is. And like those, you have to have a totally different way of, like you have to decide what frame rate you might probably be able to smoothly run at and then run the timing yourself.
Yeah.
And so right there for one game, I've just said like 5 different strategies. We had to do all this on Braid Anniversary, right? Which is why it's fresh in my mind. And that's just hard. It's way harder just to draw frames. Like it doesn't even matter what's in the frame. Just to draw frames smoothly is way harder. And then of course, because this scene is so full of graphical assets that the GPU might have a more highly varying amount of time trying to deal with than it did in the past, right?
Yeah.
That's harder. And then the thing that people don't realize is you also can't, like if I need to have these 5 different strategies for trying to have a smooth frame rate, that's not an isolatable problem. It's not like I just write that code and it just lives somewhere and then it's done, because it affects everything in my game, right? So the other problem that people don't realize is it is kind of generally an unsolved problem to have a game where the physics does not depend on the frame rate, right? So like
Correct.
Making the experience the same for somebody who's on a 60 hertz monitor and somebody who's on a 240 hertz monitor is actually really hard if you really care and you're trying to do it right. Like there are mathematical constructs that could help you, right? There's like various numerical integration techniques and stuff, but that's actually in some cases very hard to employ. And it also ignores that like the basic structure of a game is you have like if statements in the middle of the frame that make stuff happen. And then if you want those to happen exactly the same, like just regular gameplay code to happen exactly the same for a 60 hertz player as a 240 hertz player, you kind of have to gimp the 240 hertz player's experience, which
Yeah.
isn't a good way to do it, because the reason why you bought a better monitor is you want a better game experience. So all this stuff is, I could go on for days about this. This is just 2 examples of how it is very hard now to make a high quality game, but there are like 100 examples.
Well,
that I could go do.
you're the opposite of me, because I can't write my own language. I know you're writing your own language, right? What's it called?
Yeah. It doesn't have an official name.
Okay.
So don't worry about it. It's not publicly available.
Oh, it's
so,
not okay. I wasn't sure
yeah.
if you had it like open source or something. But
No,
anyway,
at some point we will, but it's not yet.
So you're like the opposite of me, and you might be the opposite of most of the people listening right now, because in my head I'm like, okay, if all these problems exist, I'm just going to let Unity handle it. I'm going to let Unreal handle it.
Yeah.
And my question to you is, isn't that the case though? Like, isn't Unity going to do its best to keep the frame rate stable, and
Well,
we can just
in
rely on
theory-
Unity, right? So it makes it easier for game development.
In theory, that's true. And that would be an advantage of using those engines. But in practice, like, dude, I can't even get 2/3 of these games to go full screen correctly. And like, why not? Like, if you use the engine and it solves the problems for you, why do I have all these problems where like, oh, wait, I went full screen. Oh, it's in a window on my second monitor. Let me try to move it back.
It's true.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's like not even cropped correctly on the screen now. Oh,
So-
my input is somehow like 1/3 of the screen off. Like, I have these problems all the time. And then, frame rate is a subtler problem though. So to get to that specifically,
Yeah.
these engines definitely do have like code to try to do all this stuff that I just said, but they're not magic. So they don't know exactly what your game wants to employ and when in terms of these strategies. And then even if you just let the engine do one, that problem that I mentioned about gameplay code being inherently frame rate dependent is still there. Like,
Yeah.
maybe if you're spawning some particles are actually the easiest thing to make frame rate independent, but we'll use that as an example. So the engine could do a really good job making the particle systems behave exactly the same at varying frame rates, right? But then, something else like, let's say I've got a sci-fi driving game. I don't know why this is the image that came to hit my mind, but I've got a sci-fi driving game and I've got like a magnet and I'm pulling on something that's following my car or something. Like, if I wrote the code to do that, it's probably frame rate dependent unless I was very, very careful.
Right.
And so then you have to lean on the engine for everything. And the problem is there's always just some point where they didn't do what you need and you need
Yeah.
to do some stuff.
Is this something that bothers you on a core sort of principled level, or is it truly a problem with development?
What bothers me the most is that nobody seems to care about any of this stuff. Like, development is getting harder and harder.
Yeah.
Not even just in games, just like in software, broadly speaking. Like, the
Yeah.
pile of software that exists is getting crazier and crazier.
Uh-huh.
The operating systems that we all run on are getting crazier and crazier. And it's so much harder to make a program that works correctly than it was like 20
Okay.
years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And people seem very unconcerned about this, and it just makes me sad. And like, as somebody who likes good craftsmanship, it just makes me sad, because it just means every program is going to be a thing where it's like, does this really work? I don't know. But I've
Right.
tried to talk to people about this. I've even given little speeches about this, and usually my speeches go very well, but this is one where I've given it twice and it hasn't gone well either time, because people have a hard time believing that software is in a declining state when they can see cool new toys all the time, right? Like, oh, dude, go check out these images that Midjourney could generate now. That's obviously advancement, and it is advancement, but things are so multi-dimensional that you can advance in some directions while declining in other directions, right?
So it's becoming more and more like jumbled and chaotic naturally. It's almost like what's that law where everything becomes more and more chaotic, and is it entropy or something like that?
Just entropy, yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, is that what you're saying? Is like software is just, it naturally has devolved and become more and more complicated.
Software engineers, when you go learn software engineering in school, one of the things that you're supposed to be learning, and that they do teach in theory, is like, staving off entropy in that way, right? It's like, this is why we structure our code and try to write things in a clean way and refactor them when they get messy and stuff. But somehow, just as a discipline of software engineers globally, we just always take that in the wrong direction and make bigger messes. So you can be thinking, in fact, this probably characterizes like most code by people who thinking they are writing clean code. Like, you can be thinking that you're factoring something very nicely and all the concerns are separated and whatever, and then but you end up writing 10 times as much code as you should have had to solve the problem, and so the pile is 10 times as big.
Yes.
And then it's like, what? And then everybody has to deal with that after that, right?